first talk is going to be provided by Kathe Todd-Brown from the University of Florida, and it's going to be about global soil carbon potential. Kate?
Good morning, everyone. All right, so I don't have the slides on the laptop, so I'm going to be pivoting a lot, and I'm going to be trying to remember to look at you guys, but I am going to be glancing over my shoulder from time to time, and I've been told to hold the mic high. All right, so I will be shifting a little bit, and we've heard a lot of really great talks about sort of lithology and plate tectonics. I'm going to be talking about the little tiny thin slice of soil at the surface of the earth. And for me, deep soil is anything that goes down below 1 meter. So all of the soil that you're going to be, all the soil carbon stocks that you're going to be hearing in here are the top 1 meter of soil globally. And this study came out of a conversation at the International Soil Modeling Consortium, sorry, where we were like, okay, as researchers, we say a lot of, okay, this is wrong, and here's why it is wrong, and here's how we can do it better, and yada, yada, yada. We started from the premise with this study of, well, what if everyone is right? Is there a way that we can reconcile differences in modeling approaches that we were getting for soil carbon stock estimates that would inform us about drama? Could inform us a little bit about the global biogeochemistry. So from that premise, we convened we had about 10 co-authors. Like I said, this was a working group out of the International Soil Carbon Consortium. And I like to put my collaborators up front because otherwise I sometimes gloss over them. This was definitely a group effort over several years. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that collaboration came together at the end of the talk. Right, so soil carbon models. Soil carbon models are traditionally first-order linear ordinary differential equations. So the rate of change of the system is proportional to the amount of carbon that is there. Computationally, this is relatively straightforward. Should look really familiar to anyone who took ODEs or even Calculus 1. But essentially what happens is we have our plants that are growing on our surface of our soil that put drop litter into the soils themselves. The model then allocates this between different pools that's defined by their turnover time or their exit rate. So we think of fast decomposition happening on the order of like under a year or so, and that's generally things like dead leaves is often what the analogy that's drawn to. And then carbon leaves that pool and is either respired as CO2, and there's the end of the stage, respired as CO2 or transferred into slower turnover pools. This exit rate is further modified by temperature and moisture, and we'll talk a little bit more about that moving forward. But this is a traditional soil carbon model that's implemented in a lot of the Earth system simulations. So CLM, for example, here, this came out of the sort of seminal paper for this is out of the 1980s by Parton et al. So this is a fairly well-established paradigm, and a lot of the larger Earth system models use this. Except the digital soil folks. So there's another realm of thinking that sort of emerged from soil surveys and building up maps of soil carbon stocks for regional soil surveys that rely on machine learning approaches. And so this is the Harmonized World Soil Database soil map. This is one of the first global soil products that was published, initially published in the 2013 was the 1.0 version, and 2.0 came out in 2023, and that's the product that you're going to see used here. Am I still on? Yeah. Okay. All right, cool. Right. So this uses, mostly this is sort of a random forest approach, which is very different than that first order linear process-based model that I talked about prior. And as some of part of my earlier work in my dissertation, you compare them. So in 2013, we took a suite of CMIP-5 models. So this is not the current CMIP suite for the IPCC report. This is the previous one. But we compared their soil carbon stocks to the Harmonized World Soil Database 2.0. So this is the prior version of the Harmonized World Soil Database as well. And they actually, if you look at it, the global totals, you can sort of squint and say, we're almost kind of hitting the side of the barn. But when you start drilling down to their distributions, their sort of where carbon is stored, what biome it's stored in, they start diverging quite a lot. So in general, the machine learning models that we get from the digital soil world don't tend to match very well the Earth system simulations that are coming out of the more process-based models. So can we reconcile that? Yeah. So what if both of these were right? And what if their disagreement was disequilibrium? So for the Earth system models, we often spin it up to steady state, and then we run the simulation forward. What if the difference between these two models was that disequilibrium disagreement? What if that was the assumption that we were getting wrong here? So what we did is we put it back in a black box. So instead of that multi-pool approach, we took a one soil carbon pool, and we said, okay, can we drive a one pool model with the values, the driving values from the digital maps and the parameters from the Earth system model? Right, so we took the parameters from the Earth system simulations, and no surprise, there was some disagreement or some variation in their inferred parameterization. We said, great, let's capture that. So this is your temperature sensitivity, your rate of change is equal to your inputs times your decay rate modified by your temperature sensitivity and your moisture sensitivity times your current carbon stock. So your temperature sensitivity, this is a Q10 temperature sensitivity. Traditionally, this is parameterized around 2. There's a little bit of wiggle here that comes from some field experiments. So this sort of captures kind of what we think is a reasonable range of temperature sensitivities in the process. Moisture sensitivity, this is another side of the barn. We got a whole bunch of biogeochemists together and said, well, so what's a reasonable function here? There's general agreement that there's some optimality around 60% and that it falls off on either end. So if you're too dry, your microbes are stressed. If you're too wet, your microbes are stressed. So they like somewhere happy in the middle. So we took this and then we forced this with global products for NPP as our input proxy, net primary production, mean surface temperature, and this was a pore space moisture map that we created, and then the Harmonized World Soil Database. I'm only going to show you the Harmonized World Soil Database drivers here. But going back to the map that we showed earlier, what we did is we then said, okay, for each pixel, we're going to assume a certain resolution and a uniform distribution within that pixel at that resolution. So if you make a histogram of all the grid cell values, you get something like this, which is your high resolution. And then if we say, okay, we really only think that we're about a kilogram per meter squared, like that's really all the precision we think we've got. That changes the histogram here. And that allows us to coarsen and lump the grids themselves. So we moved from a lat long projection to what we called climate space. So basically we took all of the grid cells and we said, okay, what's your NPP, your mean annual temperature, your pore to water ratio, and your organic carbon stock? We assigned that four-part vector an index, and then we counted how many of that index were across the globe and calculated an area for it. This now allows us to propagate these distributions. So we assumed a global distribution for our global decay rate. This is that uniform distribution as you walk across your precisions for your lat long space. You do something similar for your NPP and your temperature sensitivity and your moisture functions. This is a combination of both your driver uncertainty and your parameter uncertainty. And all of this plugged into this equation gives you your rate of change. And so now instead of a single mean value for each of your grid spaces and your maps, you have a distribution for each of your climate projections. You can then solve for steady state, your carbon stock for steady state, and we're calling that our carbon storage potential. All right, so that's the how we did it. What we found was that we've got really huge uncertainties. We sort of knew that this was going to be the case. So on the main map here is that expected value for your rate of change. The blue colors are going to be increases in soil carbon storage. The red colors are decreases in soil carbon storage. And if you look at our upper and lower maps over here on the left, you see that our lower 5% is mostly red and our upper 95% is mostly blue. If you do a grid by grid comparison, however, you do get this interesting map. So we called confident losses if both your 95 and your 5% confidence intervals showed losses in carbon storage. We called that a confident loss. If they both showed gains in carbon storage, we called that a confident gain. Otherwise, you were sort of neutral. Now, most of the globe is neutral, but there were some interesting spatial patterns for our confident gains and losses. For example, drylands look like they're losing carbon stocks. That's interesting. India, don't know what's going on for this Indian subcontinent, but India's not looking so happy. And then for confident gains, what was really fascinating that stood out to me was that Europe and the East Coast of the United States are gaining carbon storage. And to me, that says that we might be able to manage these urban landscapes where Europe and US are to increase carbon sequestration and to sort of help this natural process along moving forward to maybe draw down some of the atmospheric CO2. If you were a soil scientist at this point, you'd be looking at this map and going, well, what about the northern peats? So northern peats in, for example, up here in northern Canada and some parts of Asia are traditionally thought of as being very vulnerable carbon stocks. And they don't necessarily stand out a whole lot in this part of the analysis. But if you look at the total storage potential, and this is the difference between the storage potential on the back end and our current stocks, our modern stocks, this is where those northern peats really pop. So this analysis says that the losses are going to be slow, but they're going to be long and big. So we are seeing quite a bit of vulnerability in these northern peats, which is a little, it's an expected result. It's good that we captured that in this analysis. Right, so merging both the machine learning and the process-based soil carbon models, we were able to say something from this disequilibrium analysis here. There were large uncertainties that need to be accounted for. I think that's something that we often miss in the Earth system simulations. A lot of those ensemble runs were really designed for differences in initial condition, not ranges in parameterizations. So that's something for us to think about as a community. And we can still say something with all of these uncertainties. Right. I wanted to say a few things about collaboration. This is a great group to talk about collaboration with. So this study was the results of 2 years of meetings every other week for the most part. Most of these people are not graduate students or postdocs. Most of them are faculty or staff scientists. So it was really quite fascinating that we were able to get professors to show up every other week to a working group and produce some really interesting results. So yeah, how did we do this? Know your why. So know why you're convening that group. Write it down so that everyone can see it and everyone can agree on it. Listen to engage with your collaborators. If somebody is invited to a meeting, they should speak at that meeting and everyone should listen to that. They should have something to contribute. Otherwise, why are you there? Decide how to decide. There are actually quite a few ways to make decisions in groups. And being overt with your decision-making structure early on helps people know how they're expected to engage and what they're responsible for. Run a good meeting. Oh, there's so much wrapped up in this. I think we've all sat through poorly run meetings. You're much more likely to get people to show up and produce something if it's a well-run meeting. And then think about supporting the arc of collaboration with good documentation. Everything from who's at the table, why are they there, what are we doing, how are we doing it, how are we publishing it. So there's an arc of collaboration there that you can support with good documentation. Yeah. And with that, I hope I have time for questions. Oh, how does wildfire play into it? That's an excellent question. So most of the Earth system models do not have wildfire accounted for them. And most of the ML models, the driving variables that I've seen for those also don't have wildfire accounted for them. Generally speaking, wildfire is going to decrease vegetation, which will decrease the inputs into soil, which is going to draw down and decrease the soil carbon stock. So as we would expect wildfire to increase in the future, as we have more frequent, more severe wildfires, we would expect lower carbon storage.
Do you have any guesses as to what's going on in India?
Do I have guesses what's going on in India? My suspicion is that it's a data problem. Let's see if I can get the good picture. Right. So one of the challenges with digital soil maps is that you can often see the geopolitical boundaries in these maps because you have differences in data products as you cross those geopolitical boundaries. I suspect it's a data problem in the Indian subcontinent, that they're just collecting the data differently, and so that's reading differently in the global totals. But that's a really interesting question. I've also had people speculate that it was it's a shrink swell clay is a dominant soil type in that region, and that might not lend itself to that first order linear model as nicely. So the first order linear decay models might not be as applicable for those soil types. There are a couple of possible explanations there.
Great talk. So I saw you have lots of distributions for parameters when you're putting together your predictions. Did you just have to try every single combination, or is there a better approach to it?
So unlike many of the models here, this is really computationally straightforward. And you have a relatively small number of parameters, so it lends itself really, really well to a bootstrap approach. So these distributions were bootstrapped. So I don't have talk to me afterwards and I can give you the citations for where the temperature sensitivity came from. But this was a bootstrap analysis from 4 dozen field experiments where we got the confidence interval for our Q10 function here. But I think you were referring to this slide. Yeah, no, this is a bootstrap. I think we tried 2,000 and 4,000 and didn't see a big significant difference between 2 and 4,000 parameter combinations, so we just went with 2,000 parameter combinations here.
curious about Europe and the East Coast, and especially the Southeast where I live. You mentioned some land use components. Do you think that's the land use signal or climate? And if climate, what aspect?
I think for the East Coast and Europe, it is afforestation. So we're getting a lot of reclaiming of forested landscapes in both the Eastern US and Europe. And so I think that that is increasing the net primary production, or the NPP, that's going into our soils. And we're seeing a bump there. That's my speculation. The desert Southwest, I suspect this has to do with the dryland, the fact that this is a dryland. Dryland biogeochemistry is very different than mesic biogeochemistry, because you have litter that's exposed to sunlight constantly, so you get photodegradation. You also have very different moisture conditions. And so those moisture conditions are not going to be as well captured with our moisture driver that we're using here in this model. So I think dryland biogeochemistry is super interesting, not something we have a great handle on yet.
Thank you. Curious about the Amazon region. I see big neutral over there, and there's some data already showing there are parts of it that are losing carbon.
Neutral doesn't necessarily mean that it's not losing or not gaining carbon. It just means that we don't have the parameterization to say one way or the other yet. And again, similar to the drylands, it's a tropical ecosystem, and most of our data for soil dynamics comes from temperate systems. So there's a little bit of a data gap there as well. But yeah, I think that this is going to be just, we don't have the parameters constrained well enough to say one way or the other whether it's gaining or losing. It's almost certainly not at steady state, and I suspect that you're correct, especially with all the logging, slash and burn that tends to degrade the soils. Tropical systems, if they're not fully saturated, like bogs or fens or things like that, tend to actually be relatively low carbon soils. Primarily just because you've got so much, the system's going so fast, it's spinning so quickly in these systems that the stock itself is relatively small in the soil. Did I answer the question?